December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor is in flames. Over 2,400 Americans are dead. And the United States has just been dragged into the deadliest war in human history. But here's what most people don't know. While battleships burned in Hawaii, a small team of cryptanalysts in a basement in Washington, D.C. were fighting a different war, a secret war, against an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't touch, but had to defeat. The Japanese military was using a code they believed was mathematically impossible to break. They called it Unbreakable. They trusted it with their most critical secrets, battle plans, troop movements, the locations of their entire fleet. And they were wrong. Because in 1942, something extraordinary happened. American forces captured a single Japanese operational manual from a sinking submarine. What they found inside that waterlogged book would change the course of World War II forever. Today, I'm going to tell you the incredible true story of how American codebreakers cracked Japan's Unbreakable code, how they used that intelligence to win the most important naval battle in the Pacific, and how a captured enemy manual revealed the fatal flaw that the Japanese never saw coming. This is a story of mathematical genius, desperate improvisation, and the intelligence breakthrough that saved countless American lives. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is absolutely mind-blowing. What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we dive deep into the most fascinating untold stories from history. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Today's story has everything: espionage, genius-level mathematics, life or death stakes, and a twist that sounds like it came straight out of a Hollywood thriller. Except this actually happened. We're talking about JN-25, the Japanese Navy's main operational code during World War II. And before we go any further, let me be clear, this isn't just some dry history lesson. This is about real people who worked around the clock, under immense pressure, to break a code that everyone said couldn't be broken. And when they finally did, it led to the Battle of Midway, the turning point of the entire Pacific War. So grab your coffee, settle in, because this is going to take about an hour to 90 minutes, and I promise you every single minute is worth it. Let's dive in. All right, so first, we need to understand what we're dealing with here. What exactly was JN-25, and why did the Japanese think it was unbreakable? Picture this. It's the late 1930s. War is brewing in the Pacific. Japan is expanding aggressively throughout Asia, and their military knows they're eventually going to clash with the United States Navy. Now, in modern warfare, communication is everything. You need to coordinate ships, planes, and troops across thousands of miles of ocean. But here's the problem. Radio communications can be intercepted. Your enemy can listen to every single message you send. So what do? You use codes. But not just any code. The Japanese Navy developed something called JN-25, and it was a masterpiece of cryptographic engineering. Let me give you some context here. JN-25 wasn't Japan's first attempt at naval encryption. They had been developing and refining naval codes since the 1920s. The JN designation stands for Japanese Navy, and it was actually an American classification, not what the Japanese called it. The Japanese referred to it as AN code, or sometimes Code D. The 25 Spustis meant it was the 25th Japanese naval system that American cryptanalysts had identified and attempted to break. Think about that for a second. There were 24 other Japanese codes before this one. JN-25 was introduced in June 1939, and it represented the pinnacle of Japanese cryptographic thinking at that time. They had learned from vulnerabilities in their earlier systems, and designed JN-25 to be virtually impenetrable. Here's how it worked, and stay with me because this is fascinating. JN-25 was what cryptographers call a super-enciphered code. That means it had 2 layers of encryption, 2 locks on the door. First layer, they had a code book containing about 45,000 5-digit code groups. Each group represented a word, phrase, or concept. For example, attack might be 12.3.4.5, battleship might be 6.8.9.2, and so on. But here's where it gets crazy. They didn't just send those code groups. That would be too easy. Second layer, they added another 5-digit number to each code group, a randomly generated additive from a separate book of 50,000 random number groups. This additive changed regularly, sometimes daily, sometimes more frequently. So if you wanted to say attack, you take the code group, let's say 345, add the random additive, let's say 78901, and you'd get 91246. But the addition was done without carrying over. It's called non-carrying addition. So 5 plus 1 over 6, 4 plus 0 over 4, 3 plus 9 and 12, which becomes just 2, and so on. Let me break down a real example of how this worked in practice. Imagine a Japanese officer wants to send the message. Battleship Yamato departing Yokosuka at 0600. First, he'd look up each word in the codebook. Battleship, 23456, Yamato, Scissor 78901, departing, Squadron 34567, Yokosuka, Traveler 89812, at 445678600, Maro River 9023. Then, he'd take his additive book, starting at a pre-agreed page and line, and add each successive additive. 23456 plus 112345, 35791, 78901, plus 67890, 35791, 34567, plus 23456, 57903, and so on. The resulting 5-digit groups would be transmitted via radio, and they'd look completely random to anyone intercepting them. Now, let's talk about why this was so difficult to break. The codebook had 45,000 possible meanings. The additive book had 50,000 possible keys. That means there were potentially 2.25 billion possible combinations for any single 5-digit group. And remember, a typical message might contain 50 to 200 code groups. So you're not just solving one puzzle, you're solving dozens of interlocking puzzles simultaneously. Now, think about what an American codebreaker is facing. They're intercepting these messages, just random 5-digit numbers, thousands of them every day. And they need to figure out both the original code groups and the additives being used. The mathematical possibilities, we're talking about trillions of potential combinations. To put this in perspective, one American cryptanalyst later said that breaking JN25 was like trying to complete a crossword puzzle in a foreign language, where you don't know the language, you don't have all the clues, and someone keeps changing the puzzle while you're working on it. Another codebreaker described it as trying to solve an equation with two unknowns, using only partial information, where both unknowns keep changing according to rules you don't understand. And here's something people don't often realize. This was all done by hand. No digital databases, no sophisticated software algorithms. What they had were pencils and paper, mechanical adding machines, basically fancy calculators, filing cabinets full of index cards, worksheets, thousands upon thousands of worksheets. Every single intercepted message had to be manually logged, transcribed, and analyzed. Every pattern had to be spotted by human eyes and human brains. One veteran codebreaker later recalled that their basement workspace was filled with mountains of paper, worksheets stacked on every available surface filing cabinets lining every wall, and the constant sound of adding machines clicking away like a room full of mechanical crickets. The Japanese military was so confident in the system that they used it for their most sensitive communications. Fleet movements, attack plans, supply convoy routes. Everything went through JN25. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself relied on this code to coordinate the attack on Pearl Harbor. He believed, like everyone in the Japanese Navy, that JN25 was mathematically unbreakable. And honestly, they had good reason to think so. Japanese cryptographers had done the math. They calculated that even if an enemy captured a code book, which they considered nearly impossible, the additive layer would still protect the messages. And even if the enemy somehow figured out the current additive pattern, the Japanese could change it overnight, resetting the enemy's progress to 0. They also believed that the sheer volume of possibilities would overwhelm any code-breaking effort. With 1930s and early 1940s technology, it simply seemed impossible to process enough messages, identify enough patterns, and test enough hypotheses to crack the system. But here's what the Japanese didn't count on: American stubbornness, mathematical brilliance, and an absolutely obsessive attention to detail. Even before Pearl Harbor, a small group of Navy cryptanalysts had been working on JN25. And I mean small. We're talking about maybe 50 people total, working in cramped offices with primitive equipment by today's standards. The main American cryptanalytic efforts were divided between several locations. Hypo in Hawaii, also Navy-run, worked on the same traffic from a Central Pacific perspective. OP-20G in Washington, D.C. was the Navy's main cryptanalytic headquarters, coordinating the overall effort and working on diplomatic and military codes. These stations competed with each other as much as they cooperated. There was rivalry, ego, and bureaucratic territorialism even in this critical work. But they all shared one goal: break JN25. These weren't supercomputers analyzing millions of calculations per second. These were people with pencils, paper, and adding machines, manually tracking patterns in thousands upon thousands of intercepted messages. The team was led by people like Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant and eccentric cryptanalyst who would work 20-hour days, living on coffee and cigarettes, obsessed with cracking the code. Rochefort was a fascinating character. He had studied Japanese in the 1920s and 1930s, living in Japan for 3 years to learn the language and culture. He understood not just the Japanese language, but how Japanese naval officers thought, how they communicated, what phrases they commonly used. He was known for his informal work style, often showing up to his basement office in a smoking jacket and carpet slippers instead of a proper uniform. His superiors in Washington were sometimes scandalized, but Rochefort didn't care. He He was there to break codes, not win fashion contests. By December 1941, they had made very limited progress. They could crack maybe 10-15% of JN-25 messages, and even that took weeks of work, not nearly enough to provide actionable intelligence. To understand what 10-15% means in practical terms, they might be able to identify that a message was about ship movements. They might recognize a few ship names or locations, but they couldn't read enough to understand the complete operational picture. It was like overhearing a conversation in a foreign language where you know a few words. You might catch tomorrow, carrier, and east, but you don't know what's happening tomorrow, which carrier, or how far east. This partial understanding was frustrating but not useless. Even fragmentary intelligence could sometimes provide clues. But it wasn't enough to predict Japanese operations or provide tactical advantages. Then Pearl Harbor happened. And suddenly, breaking JN-25 wasn't just an academic exercise. It was a matter of life and death. After Pearl Harbor, everything changed. The pressure on the Codebreakers went from intense to absolutely crushing. American forces were reeling. The Pacific Fleet was severely damaged. The Japanese were advancing rapidly through the Pacific, seizing territory across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, and the American military desperately needed intelligence. They needed to know where the Japanese were going next. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, there was a real sense of panic in Washington and at Pacific headquarters. The U.S. had lost 8 battleships at Pearl Harbor, though several would eventually be raised and repaired. That wasn't clear at the time. American and Allied territories were falling like dominoes. Wake Island fell on December 23rd, Hong Kong on December 25th, Manila on January 2nd. By February 1942, Singapore, the supposedly impregnable Gibraltar of the East, had surrendered to Japanese forces. The British Royal Navy had lost the battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse. The Dutch East Indies were being overrun. The Japanese seemed unstoppable, and American commanders were operating largely in the dark, unsure where the next blow would fall. The code-breaking operation got a massive influx of resources. More people, more equipment, and most importantly, more intercepted messages to analyze. See, here's something crucial about code breaking. It's a volume game. The more messages you intercept, the more patterns you can identify. And after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy was communicating constantly, coordinating their rapid expansion across the Pacific. American listening stations in Hawaii, the Philippines, before it fell, and locations across the Pacific were intercepting thousands of JN-25 messages every single day. The Navy began recruiting more cryptanalysts, mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword puzzle experts, anyone with the right kind of analytical mind. They even recruited from universities, looking for professors and graduate students with skills in mathematics, statistics, or languages. Many of these new recruits had to be trained from scratch. The Navy established crash courses in cryptanalysis, teaching the fundamentals of code systems, frequency analysis, and pattern recognition. Now, let me explain how they actually worked on breaking this code, because it's genuinely incredible. First, radio operators at listening stations across the Pacific would intercept Japanese transmissions. These operators had to have excellent skills. They needed to copy Morse code at high speeds, often dealing with static, interference, and weak signals. Every intercepted message would be logged with metadata: the time it was sent, the frequency it was transmitted on, the estimated direction it came from, its length, and most importantly, its call signs, the identifying codes for the sender and recipient. Even before anyone tried to decrypt the content, analysts would study the patterns of communication, what's called traffic analysis. They'd track which stations were communicating with each other, how often, and at what times. They'd notice when communication volumes increased or decreased. They'd identify which call signs seemed to be associated with which naval units. This traffic analysis could reveal a lot. For instance, if they noticed a sudden increase in messages between a particular call sign and multiple other stations, they might deduce that call sign belonged to a flagship coordinating an operation. Then, they'd start collecting all the intercepted messages and logging every 5-digit group. They maintained enormous databases, actually more like enormous filing systems, of every code group they'd ever seen. They had specialized worksheets designed for this purpose. Each worksheet might track a particular code group across dozens or hundreds of messages, noting when and where it appeared, what other code groups appeared near it, and any patterns they could identify. They'd analyze which 5-digit groups appeared most frequently. This was crucial because some concepts appear in messages far more often than others. For example, words like the, to, from, and at appear constantly in English. Similarly, Japanese naval messages would frequently include common terms like dates, times, directions, and standard naval terminology. If a particular encrypted group appeared very frequently, it was likely a common word or phrase. This gave them starting points for their analysis. Then, they'd start looking for patterns. If the same 5-digit group appeared in multiple messages, that was significant. It meant that particular group, after the additive was applied, was probably a common word or phrase. They called these cribs, educated guesses about what certain code groups might mean. For example, almost every Japanese naval message started with a specific pattern indicating the date and time. That gave them a foothold. They knew what the beginning of messages should say, so they could make educated guesses about what those encrypted groups meant. They also noticed that certain code groups appeared together frequently, suggesting they might be related phrases. Like, you'd often see certain patterns in messages that seemed to be about supply convoys, or other patterns in messages about fleet movements. But remember, they still had the additive layer to deal with. This was the real killer. Even if they figured out that encrypted group 325791 probably meant battleship, they still didn't know if the original code group was 23456 or 12345 or 98765, because they didn't know what additive had been applied. The breakthrough came when they realized something crucial. The Japanese were reusing their additive books. See, creating truly random number tables is actually really difficult and time-consuming. You can't just make them up. If a human tries to generate random numbers, they unconsciously create patterns. True random numbers require physical processes or extremely complex mathematical algorithms. The Japanese Navy couldn't produce new additive books fast enough for all their stations and ships across the entire Pacific. Every major base, every flagship, every important station needed copies of these books. Printing, distributing, and securely transporting thousands of books filled with random numbers across an ocean at war was a logistical nightmare. So they started reusing them. Sometimes the same additive book would be used for weeks or even months. Once the American codebreakers realized this, they could start to strip away the additive layer. Here's how it worked. If they could identify the additive being used, they could subtract it from the intercepted messages and get back to the original code groups. But how do you identify the additive? Through a painstaking process. First, they'd identify messages that they strongly suspected contained certain known phrases. For instance, messages that appeared to be weather reports would likely contain standard meteorological terminology. Then, they'd make educated guesses about what those code groups originally were. If their guess was right, they could calculate what the additive must have been by reverse engineering. Encrypted group minus suspected original group equals additive. Then they'd test that additive on other messages. If it produced sensible results, if other encrypted groups, when that additive was subtracted, turned into code groups that seemed to make sense, then they knew they were on the right track. This process was called stripping, and it was painstaking work. It might take days or weeks to identify even a portion of an additive book. And if the Japanese changed their additives, which they did periodically, the whole process would have to start over. Let me tell you more about some of the heroes of this story, because these people deserve to be remembered. Commander Joseph Rochefort ran Station Hypo in Hawaii, the main code-breaking center in the Pacific. He was a workaholic genius who wore a smoking jacket and slippers to work and practically lived in the basement where his team operated. Rochefort had an unusual career path. He had enlisted in the Navy as a young man, worked his way up through the ranks, and eventually was commissioned as an officer. This gave him a different perspective than officers who came from the Naval Academy. He understood the enlisted ranks, and his leadership style reflected that. His basement headquarters at Pearl Harbor was legendary. It was nicknamed the Dungeon by the team. The space was cramped, poorly ventilated, and filled with cigarette smoke. Rochefort was known for his intense focus. He could work for 20 hours straight, fueled by coffee and nicotine, completely absorbed in the patterns of Japanese naval communications. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer was Rochefort's chief cryptanalyst. Dyer had an almost supernatural ability to spot patterns in the intercepted traffic. He could look at columns of 5-digit numbers and somehow intuit relationships that others missed. Dyer was quieter than Rochefort, more reserved but equally brilliant. While Rochefort was the leader and strategist, Dyer was the technical genius who could dive deep into the mathematical complexities of the code. Lieutenant Commander Wesley Ham Wright was another key member of the team. Wright specialized in traffic analysis, studying the patterns of Japanese communications even without reading the content. He could identify Japanese naval units by their communication patterns, track their movements, and deduce operational plans just from analyzing who was talking to whom and when. Commander Edwin T. Layton was Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer. While not a codebreaker himself, Layton was the crucial link between Rochefort's team and the Admiral. He had to take the fragmentary, uncertain intelligence from the codebreakers and present it in a way that Admiral Nimitz could use to make life-and-death decisions. Layton had studied Japanese before the war and had even served as a language officer in Japan. He understood Japanese culture and naval thinking, which made him better able to interpret the intelligence his team was gathering. And then there were the women. This is a part of the story that often gets overlooked, but it's absolutely crucial. Dozens of women served as cryptanalytic assistants at Station Hypo and other locations. They did the tedious but absolutely essential work of tracking, sorting, and analyzing thousands of message groups. They maintained the filing systems, massive card catalogs containing every code group ever intercepted, cross-referenced in multiple ways. They prepared the worksheets that analysts used. They operated the mechanical tabulating machines. They transcribed messages and double-checked calculations. Names like Agnes Meyer Driscoll, known as Miss Aggie, stand out. Driscoll was one of the Navy's top cryptanalysts, and she had been working on Japanese code since the 1920s. Women like Mary Zarnsdorf, Eunice Wilson, and others worked alongside the men, often doing equally complex analytical work, though they rarely received equivalent recognition or rank. The conditions these people worked under were grueling. Station Hypo operated 24/7. The team worked in shifts around the clock, 7 days a week. There were no days off, no holidays. The war didn't stop, so neither could they. The basement where they worked was poorly ventilated. In Hawaii's tropical climate, it was hot, humid, and uncomfortable. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Nearly everyone smoked constantly to deal with the stress. The noise was constant. The clacking of typewriters, the clicking of adding machines, people calling out numbers or discussing patterns. And underlying it all, the weight of knowing that lives depended on their work. One team member later recalled, "We were always aware that men were dying out there. Every day we couldn't break the code, every message we couldn't read might mean another ship sunk, another battle lost. The pressure was incredible." By early 1942, they were making real progress. They could now read maybe 20 to 25% of JN-25 messages, sometimes more if the message used common phrases they'd already identified. This was enough to start providing useful intelligence. They could often determine the general nature of a message, whether it was about ship movements, supply convoys, or operational orders. They could sometimes identify which units were involved and roughly where they were going. But there were still massive gaps. Complete messages remained elusive. And critically, they were always working with a delay. It would take days or even weeks to decrypt a message, by which time the intelligence might be outdated. The Japanese were also security conscious in some ways. They avoided using specific ship names and messages when possible, instead using designators or code names. They would sometimes transmit deceptive messages to confuse any potential eavesdroppers. Then, in late February 1942, everything changed. The Japanese Navy instituted JN-25B, a new version of the code with a new codebook and new additives. This was standard procedure for the Japanese. They would periodically update their codes to maintain security. But for the American codebreakers, it was devastating. The American codebreakers' progress was essentially reset to zero overnight. All their laboriously compiled worksheets showing code group meanings, useless. The patterns they had identified, gone. The additive books they'd partially reconstructed, obsolete. They had to start all over again. Now it's spring of 1942. The American military is desperate for intelligence about Japanese plans. There were rumors and indications that Japan was planning a major operation, something big, but where and when? Some intelligence suggested an attack on Australia. Others thought it might be Port Moresby in New Guinea, or perhaps another strike at Pearl Harbor. Some even worried about an invasion of Hawaii itself, or attacks on the west coast of the United States. The codebreakers were working frantically to rebuild their understanding of the new JN-25B system. But they had some advantages this time. They understood the general principles of how JN-25 worked. They knew what kinds of patterns to look for. They had more people, more resources, and more experience. Most importantly, they had developed better methodologies. They were more systematic, more organized. They had learned from their earlier efforts. Even so, it was a race against time. Every day, every hour mattered. And then, something extraordinary happened that would change everything. May 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea has just concluded. The first naval battle where the opposing ships never actually saw each other, fought entirely by aircraft. The Battle of the Coral Sea itself was a complicated engagement. Tactically, it was roughly a draw. Both sides lost ships, and both sides inflicted damage on the other. The Americans lost the carrier USS Lexington and suffered damage to the Yorktown. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho and suffered damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku. But strategically, it was significant. The Japanese were forced to abandon their planned invasion of Port Moresby, marking the first time their advance had been checked. During this battle, American forces sank several Japanese submarines and smaller vessels. And from one of these sunken vessels, Navy divers recovered something incredible, a waterlogged but readable copy of a Japanese naval code manual. Let me give you more details about how this actually happened, because it's a remarkable story in itself. After the battle, American ships remained in the area to search for survivors and salvage what they could. This was standard procedure after naval engagements. You'd look for your own survivors, gather intelligence, and deny the enemy any resources. A team of Navy divers was sent down to examine a partially sunken Japanese vessel. The exact identity of the vessel is somewhat unclear in historical records. Different sources describe it as a submarine, a destroyer, or a smaller patrol vessel. And what we know for certain is that divers found documents in the vessel's communication room. These documents were in watertight containers or had been protected enough that, while waterlogged, they were still legible. The divers risked their lives to retrieve these materials. Working in damaged, unstable vessels underwater is extremely dangerous. There's always a risk of collapse, entanglement, or drowning. When they brought the documents to the surface, the intelligence officers immediately recognized their potential value. These weren't just any papers, they were official Japanese Navy procedural manuals. Now, I need to be clear here about what exactly this manual was, because there's been some confusion in historical accounts. This wasn't the actual JN-25 codebook itself. That would have been the ultimate prize, and the Japanese were extremely careful about those. Codebooks were supposed to be destroyed immediately if there was any risk of capture. Japanese communication officers had specific procedures. If a ship was sinking or being overrun, they were supposed to throw codebooks overboard in weighted bags or burn them. What the Americans recovered was an operational procedures manual that explained how the Japanese Navy used JN-25 in practice. Think of it this way. The codebook was like a dictionary. It told you what each code group meant, but the operational manual was like a style guide and instruction book. It told you how to actually use that dictionary when composing and sending messages. And this turned out to be just as valuable, maybe even more so. Here's what this manual revealed. First, confirmation of procedures. The manual confirmed exactly how the additive system worked. The specific mathematical procedures the Japanese operators used to encipher and decipher messages. The American cryptanalysts had already deduced much of this through analysis, but having it confirmed was enormously valuable. It meant they weren't wasting time pursuing wrong theories. The manual also revealed specific details about how additives were applied, which page of the additive book to start with, how to proceed through the book, when to loop back to the beginning, and so on. Second, standard message formats. This was huge. The manual showed that certain types of messages, weather reports, position updates, supply requests, damage reports, followed predictable patterns and used specific terminology. For example, weather reports always started with specific phrases and followed a standard format: location, time, wind speed and direction, visibility, sea conditions, etc. Position reports similarly followed predictable patterns: ship identification, current position in latitude and longitude, heading, speed, next waypoint. Knowing these formats meant the codebreakers could make much more confident guesses about what certain code groups meant. If they knew a message was a weather report, they knew it had to contain certain types of information in a certain order. Third, geographic encoding tables. The manual included partial tables showing how geographic locations were encoded. The Japanese had specific code groups for different ports, islands, and strategic locations across the Pacific. This was incredibly valuable because location information was crucial for operational intelligence. Knowing that a particular code group meant Truk, or Rabaul, or Midway could unlock the meaning of entire messages. Fourth, communication protocols. The manual revealed the protocols for different types of communications, how urgent messages were flagged, how acknowledgments were sent, how corrections were made if there was an error in transmission. It showed the hierarchy of communication, which stations reported to which headquarters, which ships communicated directly with each other versus through intermediary stations. Fifth, security procedures and their shortcuts. And this was the real goldmine. The manual revealed security procedures, and more importantly, it inadvertently revealed how those procedures were actually implemented in practice, including the shortcuts operators took. The manual made clear that Japanese radio operators were taking shortcuts to save time. Here's the thing about any complex security procedure. In practice, people will simplify it if they can, especially when they're busy, under pressure, or doing something routine. The manual showed that when sending routine weather reports or position updates, operators would often use abbreviated formats and common phrases. These stereotyped messages gave American codebreakers exactly the kind of patterns they needed. For example, if you are a radio operator on a ship and you need to send a routine position report twice a day, every day, you're going to develop a streamlined way of doing it. You'll use the same phrases, the same format, the same terminology. It becomes almost automatic. The manual also revealed that the Japanese Navy's communication procedures had a critical vulnerability. They were using a limited set of introductory phrases and message headers. Think about it like this. If every message starts with standard phrases like to Combined Fleet Headquarters from Task Force 16, date May 27th, time 0800. Then the codebreakers know what those first few code groups probably represent, even before they decrypt the rest of the message. Once you know the beginning of messages, you can start stripping additives more easily, and once you can strip additives, you can start reading content. The manual also inadvertently revealed assumptions about operational security that the Japanese considered adequate, but which actually created vulnerabilities. For instance, The Japanese assumed that even if an enemy figured out parts of the code, the additive layer would prevent them from reading messages in real time. They didn't fully appreciate how much information could be derived from partial decryption or from traffic analysis. There's another aspect here that's fascinating. The human psychology of code use. The Japanese operators who used JN-25 every day became, in a sense, too comfortable with it. They trusted it completely. They believed it was unbreakable, so they didn't maintain the level of vigilance they might have otherwise. They would sometimes be sloppy about exactly following procedures. They would take shortcuts. They would make assumptions. And the captured manual revealed all of this because it was written for those operators. It was trying to standardize procedures and prevent exactly the kind of variations and shortcuts that were creating security vulnerabilities. Armed with this captured manual, Rochefort's team at Station Hypo went into overdrive. They now understood the Japanese system better than they ever had before. They could make educated guesses about message content based on the format and length. They could identify which messages were routine reports versus critical operational orders. The manual allowed them to build what cryptanalysts call a depth chart, a systematic reconstruction of the codebook based on confirmed information rather than just educated guesses. Most importantly, they could start building a reconstruction of the current JN-25B codebook much faster than before. With the information from the manual, the code-breaking process became much more systematic. Step 1. Identify message types based on length, format, and context from traffic analysis. Step 2. Use the known standard formats from the manual to make high-confidence guesses about certain code groups. Step 3. Use those confirmed code groups to help strip additives. Step 4. Use the stripped additives on other messages to reveal more code groups. Step 5. Build up a growing database of known code groups and their meanings. It was still incredibly difficult work. The manual didn't just give them the ability to read Japanese messages instantly. What it did was accelerate their code-breaking efforts by months, maybe even a year. They still had to intercept messages, log them, analyze them, test hypotheses, confirm theories, and gradually build their understanding. But now they had a roadmap. They understood the territory they were exploring. Through April and May of 1942, the pace of progress accelerated. Every day they were adding more code groups to their database. Every day they were understanding more of the additive patterns. Every day they could read a higher percentage of intercepted messages. It was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle where every piece you place makes it easier to place the next piece. As their understanding grew, their ability to make accurate guesses improved, which led to more confirmed code groups, which accelerated the process further. By late May 1942, Rochefort's team was achieving something extraordinary. They were reading portions of current Japanese naval messages, not weeks after they were sent, but within days, sometimes within hours. This was a game changer. Intelligence that's days old is useful. Intelligence that's hours old can change the outcome of battles. And what they were reading was alarming. The Japanese were clearly planning a massive operation. Message traffic had increased dramatically. References to AF started appearing repeatedly, clearly a code designation for some strategic location. They also started seeing references to dates in early June. They saw mentions of multiple carrier divisions. They saw coordination between different Japanese naval forces that suggested a major combined operation. But where was AF? That was the critical question. The designation AF appeared in dozens of messages throughout late May. Context made it clear that AF was the target of an upcoming major operation. But what was AF? Some analysts in Washington believed AF was the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Japanese forces had been active in that area, and there were indications of an operation planned there. Others thought it might be Fiji or Samoa, stepping stones that could threaten the supply line between the United States and Australia. Some even thought AF might be the Hawaiian Islands themselves, a follow-up to Pearl Harbor. But Rochefort, using his growing understanding of JN-25 and the patterns he'd learned from the captured manual, had a different theory. He believed AF was Midway Island, a tiny American outpost 300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Rochefort's reasoning was based on multiple factors. First, traffic analysis showed that messages mentioning AF were being sent to and from the same naval units that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, suggesting another major carrier operation in the Central Pacific. Second, the geographic code groups appearing in messages alongside AF seemed consistent with locations in the Central Pacific rather than the Northern Pacific or South Pacific. Third, the timing and scale of the operation suggested a target that was strategically significant but not heavily defended, somewhere the Japanese thought they could win a decisive battle. Midway fit that profile. Fourth, and this was crucial, Rochefort understood Japanese strategic thinking. He knew that Admiral Yamamoto was obsessed with destroying the American carrier fleet. Midway would be perfect bait, an island close enough to Hawaii that the Americans would have to defend it, but far enough that they'd be operating at the limit of their range. But Rochefort needed proof. He couldn't just rely on intuition and analysis. The stakes were too high. If he was wrong, the American fleet would be positioned in the wrong place, and the Japanese would win another devastating victory. So Rochefort came up with an ingenious trick. He consulted with Admiral Nimitz and got approval for a deception operation. He had the garrison at Midway send an uncoded message, transmitted in the clear, saying that their water distillation plant had broken down and they were experiencing a freshwater shortage. This message was sent via underwater cable to avoid radio transmission that the Japanese might intercept directly. But once it reached Hawaii, it was deliberately transmitted via radio in a basic, easily readable code, the kind of administrative code that the Japanese might be able to read. The message was crafted to sound routine and genuine. Midway reports water distillation equipment malfunction. Freshwater supplies running low. Request emergency water shipment. Then, Rochefort's team waited and listened to Japanese communications. They were looking for any mention in Japanese traffic that might confirm AF was Midway. Sure enough, within 24 hours, they intercepted a Japanese message. After decryption, the message stated that AF is short on fresh water. Boom. Proof. AF was definitely Midway. Rochefort immediately reported this intelligence to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. This was it. The Japanese were sending their most powerful fleet. 4 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, the works. Intelligence indicated the attack would come in early June, probably around June 4th or 5th. The Japanese plan, as Rochefort's team gradually pieced it together, was sophisticated. They would launch a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north. Then, they would strike Midway with overwhelming force, seizing the island and establishing a forward base. Most importantly, they would lure the remaining American carrier fleet into a trap and destroy it, removing the U.S. Navy as a threat in the Pacific for years to come. It was a bold, aggressive plan, and it might have worked, except that the Americans now knew exactly when and where it would happen. Admiral Nimitz had perhaps the most important decision of the Pacific War to make. Did he trust this intelligence enough to bet everything on it? Remember, this intelligence came from a partially broken code. It was based on fragmentary messages and deductive reasoning. There were still gaps in understanding. What if Rochefort was wrong? What if AF wasn't Midway? What if the water shortage trick had been detected and the Japanese were now feeding false information? If Nimitz positioned his carriers near Midway and the Japanese struck somewhere else, the war in the Pacific might be lost. But Nimitz trusted Rochefort. He had seen the quality of the intelligence Rochefort's team had been providing. He understood the methodology. He knew Rochefort's track record. More than that, Nimitz had the wisdom to recognize that this was the best chance America was going to get. The Japanese fleet was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. If they had intelligence about Japanese plans, they had to act on it. Nimitz made his decision. He would trust the Codebreakers. He would position his fleet northeast of Midway and wait in ambush. He did. Early June 1942. Admiral Nimitz has positioned his available carriers, the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, northeast of Midway Island, waiting in ambush. Let me give you more context about just how risky this was. The Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier. Estimates were that she would need 3 months of repairs at a shipyard. Nimitz didn't have 3 months. He ordered the repair crews to do whatever they could in 3 days. Around the clock, hundreds of workers swarmed over the Yorktown, welding, patching, replacing equipment. They did 3 months of work in 72 hours. The Yorktown left Pearl Harbor with repair crews still aboard, continuing to work as the ship sailed toward Midway. The American force was smaller than ideal. Nimitz had 3 carriers. The Japanese had 4, and theirs were the elite carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, veteran ships with veteran crews. But Nimitz had one crucial advantage. Surprise, the Japanese had no idea the Americans knew they were coming. The Japanese fleet, under Admiral Yamamoto, was approaching from the northwest, completely unaware that the Americans knew they were coming. Yamamoto's plan was complex, involving multiple task forces. A northern force would attack the Aleutian Islands, Dutch Harbor, and potentially occupy Attu and Kiska Islands. This was partly strategic, securing a northern perimeter, and partly a diversion to draw American forces away from the Central Pacific. The main striking force, under Admiral Nagumo, included 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. These would strike Midway first to soften defenses, then deal with any American ships that responded. A powerful battleship group, including the super battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, would follow behind, ready to engage in a decisive surface battle once the carriers had weakened American forces. Submarine picket lines were positioned to detect and report American ship movements. It was a plan designed to overwhelm and annihilate the Americans, and on paper, it should have worked. Yamamoto had more ships, more planes, more everything. He was supremely confident. He had reason to be. His force had conquered half the Pacific in 6 months. But he didn't know that his Unbreakable code had been broken. Admiral Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers northeast of Midway in a location called Point Luck. This position was chosen carefully based on the intelligence from Rochefort's team. The Americans knew roughly when the Japanese would arrive, from which direction, and what course they'd likely take. The American carriers would wait, hidden until the Japanese were committed to their attack on Midway. Then they would strike. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the overall force from the Yorktown. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Enterprise and Hornet. These were competent, aggressive commanders willing to take calculated risks. The American pilots were briefed. They knew this was the battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew they had an advantage the enemy didn't expect: knowledge. On June 4th, 1942, the battle began. At dawn, Japanese scout planes took off to search for American ships. This was standard procedure before any operation. You wanted to know if there were enemy forces in the area. But the Japanese scouts were unlucky. Due to a combination of search pattern choices, weather, and just bad luck, they didn't spot the American carriers in time. Meanwhile, American scout planes from Midway found the Japanese fleet. At 05:34 hours, the electrifying message came in. Enemy carriers. At 0430 hours, the Japanese carriers launched their first wave against Midway Island itself. 108 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. They expected to catch the Americans by surprise. Instead, they found Midway's defenders ready and waiting. American fighters from Midway scrambled to intercept. They were outclassed. Most were obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats against superior Japanese Zeros, but they fought with desperate courage. Midway's anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The island had been reinforced based on the Codebreakers warning. Every available gun was manned and ready. The Japanese strike inflicted damage on Midway, but failed to knock out the airfield or destroy its defenses. Japanese pilots reported that a second strike would be necessary. While the Japanese planes were hitting Midway, American planes from the island were launching their own strike against the Japanese carriers. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters from Midway's Marine and Navy squadrons flew out to attack the Japanese fleet. It was a disaster. The American torpedo bombers were slow and obsolete. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire shredded them. Most were shot down without scoring a single hit. The dive bombers attacked bravely, but with limited success. But these attacks, though costly, accomplished something crucial. They kept the Japanese carriers busy and disrupted their operations. Here's where the intelligence advantage really came into play. Because Nimitz knew the Japanese were coming, he had positioned his carriers perfectly. While the Japanese thought they were alone in the area, American carriers were already launching strikes. At approximately 0700 hours, a Japanese scout plane finally spotted American ships. The pilot reported, "Have sighted 10 enemy surface ships." This changed everything for Admiral Nagumo on the Japanese flagship Akagi. He had assumed there were no American carriers in the area. Now there were enemy ships, possibly including carriers. Nagumo faced a dilemma. His planes were either returning from the Midway strike or were on deck being rearmed for a second strike on Midway. If there were American carriers out there, he needed to launch an immediate strike against them. But his planes weren't ready. They were armed with bombs for land targets, not torpedoes for ships. He made a fateful decision. Rearm the planes with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for a strike on the American ships. This meant bringing planes down to the hangar decks, removing the land attack bombs, and loading torpedoes. It created chaos on the carriers. Flight decks and hangar decks were crowded with planes, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines. At 0920 hours, American torpedo bombers from the carrier Hornet found the Japanese fleet. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, attacked without fighter escort. It was suicide. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire decimated them. Of 15 planes, 14 were shot down. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, and he spent hours floating in the ocean, watching the battle unfold. They scored no hits. Shortly after, torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown attacked. They were slaughtered too. Brave men flew slow, vulnerable planes into a storm of fire. Most died without landing a single torpedo. In the span of about an hour, American torpedo bomber squadrons were essentially destroyed. 41 out of 41 planes from 3 squadrons were shot down. It was devastating, heartbreaking. But those attacks accomplished something crucial that the pilots never knew. They pulled Japanese fighters down to low altitude, and they kept the Japanese carriers busy, maneuvering to avoid torpedoes, unable to launch strikes of their own. At 10:20 hours, American dive bombers arrived overhead. Squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey from Enterprise and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from Yorktown, had been searching for the Japanese fleet. By luck, skill, and determination, they found them at the perfect moment. The Japanese carriers were vulnerable. Their decks were crowded with planes being rearmed and refueled. Fuel lines were out. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered around. The carriers were in the worst possible state to receive an attack. All the Japanese fighters were down at low altitude, having just dealt with the American torpedo bombers. There was no high-altitude fighter cover. The Japanese weren't expecting an attack from above. Their radar, if they spotted the Americans at all, would have shown them as high-altitude threats while they were still dealing with low-altitude torpedo threats. The American dive bombers pushed over into their attacks, screaming down at 70-degree angles from 14,000 feet, accelerating to over 250 knots. In the span of just 5 minutes, literally 5 minutes, American dive bombers struck 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Multiple bombs hit each carrier. The Akagi took at least 1 bomb, possibly 2, which penetrated to the hangar deck and ignited the planes and munitions stored there. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Flames spread rapidly. Within minutes, the flagship of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force was a burning wreck. The Kaga was hit by 4 or 5 bombs. The ship was torn apart by explosions. Fire swept through the hangar decks. The carrier was doomed. The Soryu was hit by 3 bombs in quick succession. Like her sister ships, she was loaded with fueled and armed aircraft. The bombs created an inferno. The captain would eventually order the crew to abandon ship. All 3 carriers were left burning and crippled, their decks loaded with fueled and armed aircraft that created massive secondary explosions. Japanese damage control crews fought valiantly to save their ships, but the damage was too extensive. The fires were too intense. One by one, these elite carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, died. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been separated from the others and was not hit in the initial American strike. Hiryu's admiral, Tamon Yamaguchi, immediately launched a counterattack against the American carriers. Japanese planes found and attacked the Yorktown. Despite intensive anti-aircraft fire, Japanese bombers scored 3 bomb hits on the Yorktown. The carrier was badly damaged, listing, and seemed to be sinking. But American damage control crews were legendary. They stabilized the ship, restored power, and got her moving again. An incredible feat. Later that afternoon, Hiryu launched a second strike, this time with torpedo bombers. They found the Yorktown again and hit her with 2 torpedoes. This time, the damage was fatal. The Yorktown would eventually be abandoned, though she stubbornly refused to sink for several more days. But Hiryu's attacks, though successful, revealed her position. American scout planes from the Enterprise found Hiryu. Late in the afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise attacked. They hit Hiryu multiple times. Like her sister ships, Hiryu was soon engulfed in flames. By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers were either sinking or fatally damaged. Akagi would be scuttled by Japanese destroyers early on June 5th. Kaga sank on the evening of June 4th. Soryu sank on June 4th. Hiryu sank on June 5th. The Battle of Midway continued for several more days with various engagements, but the decisive phase was over. Japan had lost the core of their carrier striking force, 4 fleet carriers, over 250 aircraft, and thousands of experienced pilots and crew. These were irreplaceable losses. The Japanese also lost the cruiser Mikuma and suffered damage to other ships. American losses were significant but bearable. The carrier Yorktown, finally sunk by a Japanese submarine on June 7th, the destroyer Hammond, about 150 aircraft, and over 300 men killed. But the strategic balance had fundamentally shifted. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan never recovered from the loss of those 4 carriers and their experienced pilots and crew. More importantly, the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. For 6 months, Japanese forces had seemed unstoppable. Now, they had suffered a devastating defeat. American morale soared. Suddenly, victory seemed possible. The war would still take 3 more years of brutal fighting, but the tide had turned. But here's what makes this incredible. None of it would have been possible without the Codebreakers. Without their work, the American carriers would have been in the wrong place. They might have been lured north toward the Aleutians, or they might have been caught by surprise, unprepared. The Japanese would have struck Midway with the defenders, not fully prepared. They would have destroyed the base and established a forward position threatening Hawaii. Most critically, the Japanese fleet might have ambushed the American carriers, instead of the other way around. With surprise on their side, the Japanese would likely have won a decisive victory. Instead, the Americans were waiting in ambush, with perfect intelligence about Japanese plans, force composition, and timing. Every advantage, the positioning of the American carriers, the readiness of Midway's defenses, the timing of American strikes, all flowed from the intelligence Rochefort's team provided by breaking JN-25. And the story doesn't end at Midway. Throughout the rest of 1942 and into 1943, American codebreakers continued to provide crucial intelligence by reading JN-25 and its successors. They tracked Japanese supply convoys and provided targeting information for American submarines. American subs devastated Japan's merchant marine, sinking hundreds of ships and cutting off resources from Japan's conquered territories. Much of this success came from code-breaking intelligence. They provided advance warning of Japanese troop movements and offensive operations. This allowed American and Allied forces to prepare defenses or position forces for counterattacks. They helped identify weaknesses in Japanese defensive positions, enabling more effective American offensives. And in April 1943, JN-25 intercepts provided intelligence that led to perhaps the most controversial intelligence operation of the war. American codebreakers intercepted and decrypted messages revealing that Admiral Yamamoto himself, the architect of Pearl Harbor, Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, the commander of the combined fleet, would be flying on an inspection tour of Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands. The messages provided his exact itinerary, including departure times, arrival times, routes, and even the types of aircraft that would be used. 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers with an escort of 6 Zero fighters. This intelligence went up the chain to the highest levels. President Franklin Roosevelt personally authorized the mission to intercept and shoot down Yamamoto's plane. It was a controversial decision. Targeting a specific individual, even a military commander, was unprecedented. There were concerns about whether it was ethical, whether it violated rules of war, and whether it might provoke Japanese retaliation. But the strategic value was too great to ignore. Yamamoto was irreplaceable, a brilliant strategist with deep understanding of American capabilities and weaknesses, respected by Japanese forces and feared by the Allies. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters from the 339th Fighter Squadron, led by Major John W. Mitchell, took off from Guadalcanal. They flew a long, low-level approach over the ocean to avoid detection, over 400 miles, using dead-reckoning navigation and precise timing to intercept Yamamoto's flight at exactly the right moment. They arrived at the exact predicted time and place. The intelligence from the codebreakers was perfect. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber engaged the bombers. In the brief, intense combat that followed, both Betty bombers were shot down. Admiral Yamamoto's plane crashed in the jungle of Bougainville. Yamamoto was killed, still strapped in his seat. The loss of Yamamoto was a devastating psychological blow to Japan and a major strategic advantage for the United States. He was given a state funeral in Japan, the first such honor for a naval officer in decades. After the Yamamoto shoot-down, there were serious concerns that the Japanese might realize their codes were compromised. The Americans went to great lengths to maintain the deception. They sent scout planes to the area after the interception, creating the cover story that Yamamoto's flight had been discovered by routine reconnaissance. The operation was classified at the highest levels. Even most American military personnel didn't know the true story, and remarkably, it seems to have worked. While the Japanese conducted investigations and tightened some security procedures, they never appear to have realized the fundamental compromise of JN-25. Here's the remarkable thing. Through incredible operational security, the Japanese never fully realized that JN-25 had been comprehensively broken. They suspected occasional compromises. After Midway, there were investigations into possible security breaches. Some Japanese officers suspected code vulnerabilities. But the institutional response was to modify and update the codes rather than completely change systems. They believed the fundamental system remained secure. They continued using variations of JN-25 throughout the war, just with regular updates to codebooks and additives. This was partly due to Japanese institutional culture. Admitting that their supposedly unbreakable code had been broken would have been a massive loss of face. It was easier to blame operational security issues or luck than to accept a fundamental cryptographic failure. The Americans, for their part, were extremely careful about how they used the intelligence. They developed sophisticated cover procedures. They would often stage discovery operations, sending scout planes to find Japanese forces that they already knew were there from code intercepts. This created plausible alternative explanations for American knowledge of Japanese movements. They would sometimes deliberately not act on intelligence to avoid revealing their capabilities, if acting on every piece of intelligence would be too suspicious. Well, they'd let some opportunities pass. This operational security was critical. If the Japanese had known their codes were broken, they would have changed systems entirely, and the American advantage would have been lost. The success of Allied code breaking in the Pacific, and in Europe with Enigma and other German codes, remained classified for decades after the war ended. So let's step back and think about what this story really means. We often think of World War II in terms of battles, bombs, and military might. And those things were certainly important. But what won the Pacific War, what really turned the tide, was intelligence. It was mathematics. It was patient, methodical, unglamorous work done by people whose names most of us have never heard. People like Commander Rochefort, who worked himself to exhaustion in a basement in Hawaii. The dozens of cryptanalysts who spent hours upon hours analyzing 5-digit number groups, looking for patterns. The women who served as cryptanalytic assistants, doing critical work that often went unrecognized. The Navy divers who recovered that crucial operational manual from a sinking Japanese vessel. This story teaches us several important lessons about intelligence, warfare, and human endeavor. First, information is power. In warfare and in life, information is power. The side with better intelligence has an enormous advantage, often more important than raw military strength. At Midway, the Japanese had more ships, more planes, more firepower. But the Americans had information. They knew when and where the attack would come. That knowledge allowed a smaller force to defeat a larger one. This lesson remains relevant today. In modern conflicts, intelligence capabilities, satellites, signals intelligence, cyber operations, often matter more than traditional military hardware. Second, no code is truly unbreakable. There's no such thing as an unbreakable code. Any code created by humans can potentially be broken by humans. It's just a matter of time, resources, and determination. The Japanese believed JN-25 was mathematically secure, and from a pure mathematical standpoint, it was extremely strong. But mathematics isn't the only consideration. Human factors, the way people actually use systems, the shortcuts they take, the patterns they create, these often create vulnerabilities that pure mathematics can't prevent. Modern encryption is exponentially more sophisticated than JN-25, but the fundamental principle remains: every security system has vulnerabilities, whether technical or human. Third, success requires multiple factors. Success in any difficult endeavor rarely comes from a single factor. It's usually a combination of hard work, intelligence, skill, and yes, luck. The Codebreakers worked incredibly hard, 20-hour days, 7 days a week, for months and years. That dedication was essential. They were brilliant, mathematical geniuses, linguistic experts, pattern recognition savants. That intelligence was crucial. They had the right tools and institutional support. Even though primitive by today's standards, they had access to intercept stations, filing systems, and analytical frameworks. That infrastructure mattered. And they had luck. The capture of that operational manual, the Japanese decision to reuse additive books, the timing of the dive bomber attack at Midway. Luck played a role. All of these factors together produced success. Remove any one of them, and the outcome might have been different. Fourth, operational security is critical. The fact that the Americans could keep their code-breaking success secret for years was almost as important as the code-breaking itself. If the Japanese had discovered that JN-25 was compromised, they would have immediately changed to new systems. The American advantage would have been lost. The elaborate cover procedures, the staged discoveries, the careful rationing of how intelligence was used, the compartmentalization of information, all of this was essential. In intelligence work, protecting your sources and methods is paramount. A piece of intelligence used carelessly today might close off intelligence streams for months or years. Fifth, teamwork and collaboration matter. The code-breaking effort involved hundreds of people working together across multiple locations, Washington, Hawaii, and other Pacific stations. It required coordination between cryptanalysts, traffic analysts, translators, radio operators, administrators, and military commanders. It required trust. Admiral Nimitz trusting Rochefort's conclusions enough to bet everything on them. It required people putting aside ego and working together toward a common goal. No single individual broke JN-25. It was a collective effort, with each person contributing their expertise and effort to the larger mission. I also want to pause and acknowledge something serious. This code-breaking effort saved countless American lives. Every submarine that found a Japanese convoy because of decrypted intelligence prevented those supplies from reaching Japanese forces, potentially shortening the war. Every ambush that succeeded because Americans knew where the Japanese would be saved. American lives that would have been lost in a fair fight. Every defensive position that was prepared in advance because of advance warning saved soldiers, sailors, and Marines who might otherwise have been caught by surprise. The historians who have studied this estimate that the Pacific War might have lasted 1 to 2 years longer without the intelligence advantage provided by breaking JN-25. That could have meant hundreds of thousands of additional casualties on all sides. But we should also acknowledge that this same intelligence led to the deaths of thousands of Japanese military personnel. Every sunk convoy meant Japanese sailors drowning in the Pacific. Every ambush meant Japanese pilots shot down, Japanese soldiers killed. The Yamamoto shootdown was a targeted killing of a specific individual. War is tragedy, no matter which side you're on. The young Japanese sailors on those carriers at Midway didn't start the war. They were serving their country, just like the American sailors facing them. The Codebreakers were not motivated by hatred. They were motivated by a desire to protect their country and end the war as quickly as possible. In that sense, their work was humanitarian, even though it led to deaths. A shorter war with fewer casualties overall is better than a longer war with more casualties. But we shouldn't sanitize or romanticize it. Intelligence work in wartime means contributing to the killing of other human beings. It's a heavy moral weight, even when it's necessary and justified. For decades after the war, the story of the Codebreakers remained classified. These heroes couldn't talk about what they'd done. They couldn't tell their families, their friends, or historians. They couldn't receive public recognition for their contributions to winning the war. Many of them went to their graves without ever receiving acknowledgement for their crucial role in history. Commander Rochefort's story is particularly poignant and frustrating. After Midway, Rochefort should have been celebrated as a hero. His intelligence work had led to the most important American naval victory of the war. He deserved medals, promotion, recognition. Instead, he was treated quite poorly. Bureaucratic rivals in Washington, particularly in the Navy's intelligence establishment in D.C., were jealous of his success and resentful of his independence and unconventional style. They sidelined him. They denied him the recognition he deserved. They arranged for him to be transferred away from intelligence work to other duties. It wasn't until 1985, years after Rochefort's death in 1976, that he was finally awarded the Distinguished Service Medal he should have received in 1942. His family accepted the medal on his behalf, a small consolation for decades of injustice. It wasn't until the 1970s, when information about Ultra, the breaking of German codes, and Magic, the designation for intelligence from broken Japanese codes, was declassified, that the public finally learned the full story. Books and documentaries started appearing. Historians could finally write accurately about how the war in the Pacific was really won. Veterans could finally talk about their contributions, but by then, many of the key figures had already died. They never got to see their story told. And the women who contributed to this effort, and there were many, faced even greater challenges in getting recognition. In the 1940s, women's contributions to any field were often minimized or overlooked. This was especially true in military and intelligence work. The women who worked as cryptanalytic assistants, who maintained the filing systems, who operated the tabulating machines, who did crucial analytical work, they were essential to the success of the operation. But very few of them received individual recognition. Many of them never told their families what they did during the war, because it remained classified. They just quietly returned to civilian life, carrying secrets they couldn't share. Only in recent decades have historians begun properly documenting the contributions of women to World War II codebreaking. Books like Code Girls by Liza Mundy have helped bring these stories to light, but it's still incomplete. We still don't know the names of many of the women who contributed to breaking JN-25. Their service records are incomplete or lost. Their stories have been forgotten. This is a loss for history. These women deserve to be remembered alongside Rochefort, Dyer, and the other men whose names we know. Today, the lessons learned from breaking JN-25 continue to influence cryptography and signals intelligence. The fundamental principles of modern cryptanalysis were established during World War II. The methodologies developed by Rochefort and his colleagues, systematic message collection, traffic analysis, statistical analysis of patterns, collaborative teamwork, these remain core practices in signals intelligence today. Modern encryption is enormously more sophisticated than JN-25. We're talking about mathematical problems that would take billions of years for even supercomputers to solve through brute force. Systems like AES, Advanced Encryption Standard, or RSA encryption, use mathematical principles that are fundamentally different from the code and additive system of JN-25. They're based on problems like factoring large prime numbers or discrete logarithms, problems that are computationally infeasible to solve without the proper key. But the fundamental principles remain the same. Cryptographers try to create systems without exploitable weaknesses. And cryptanalysts look for patterns, exploit human error and operational shortcuts, gather as much data as possible, and never give up. The organizational lessons also persist. Organizations like the NSA, National Security Agency, trace their lineage directly back to these World War II code-breaking efforts. The NSA was officially formed in 1952, but it evolved from wartime agencies like the Army's Signal Intelligence Service and the Navy's OP-20G. Many World War II codebreakers went on to careers in the NSA, bringing their experience and knowledge. The NSA headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland, even has a street named Rochefort Avenue in honor of Commander Rochefort. It's a small acknowledgement of a great debt. It's worth considering how different World War II might have been without successful codebreaking. In the Pacific, without breaking JN-25, the Battle of Midway might have been a Japanese victory. The war would likely have lasted longer, possibly years longer. More Americans and Japanese would have died. The strategic situation would have been much more precarious in Europe, without breaking Enigma and other German codes. The Battle of the Atlantic might have been lost, cutting Britain off from supplies. D-Day planning would have been much more difficult without intelligence on German dispositions. German military operations would have been much more effective. Some historians estimate that Allied code-breaking shortened World War II by 1 to 2 years and saved millions of lives. That might actually be conservative. The lessons of JN-25 remain relevant in our digital age. Today's cyber conflicts often revolve around information security. Nations invest enormous resources in both protecting their own communications and attempting to compromise adversaries' systems. The human factors that made JN-25 vulnerable remain challenges today. People still take shortcuts for convenience. Users create predictable patterns. Operational security is hard to maintain consistently. Even sophisticated systems can have implementation flaws. The psychological factors also persist. Organizations can become overconfident in their security, just as the Japanese were overconfident in JN-25. This overconfidence can lead to complacency and mistakes. So the next time you hear about the Battle of Midway or the Pacific War, remember, behind the aircraft carriers and the brave pilots and the dramatic battles, there were mathematicians and linguists and analysts working around the clock with pencils and paper. They worked in basements and cramped offices, breathing stale air and cigarette smoke, their eyes strained from examining endless columns of numbers. They worked through exhaustion, through frustration, through self-doubt. They worked knowing that lives depended on their success, that the fate of nations hung on whether they could find patterns in apparent randomness. They broke the Unbreakable code. They turned the tide of history, and many of them never received the recognition they deserved during their lifetimes. That captured Japanese manual, waterlogged, rescued from a sinking submarine, revealed weaknesses the enemy never saw in their own system. And those weaknesses, exploited by brilliant, dedicated people working under incredible pressure, changed the course of World War II. Think about what we can learn from this story for our own lives. Persistence matters. The Codebreakers didn't give up when JN-25B replaced JN-25A and reset their progress. They started over and kept working. Details matter. Small observations, patterns in message formats, frequency of certain code groups led to major breakthroughs. Teams matter. No individual broke JN-25 alone. It required diverse skills, collaborative effort, and coordinated action across multiple locations. Information matters. Having the right information at the right time can be more valuable than superior resources. Humility matters. The Japanese were overconfident in their codes. The Americans approached the problem with appropriate humility, knowing it would be difficult but refusing to believe it was impossible. These are lessons we can apply whether we're tackling difficult problems at work, pursuing challenging personal goals, or dealing with complex situations in our lives. I want to end by saying we owe these Codebreakers a debt we can never fully repay. They saved countless lives. They shortened a terrible war. They demonstrated that intelligence, dedication, and persistence can overcome enormous challenges. Commander Joseph Rochefort, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wright, Commander Edwin Layton, Agnes Meyer Driscoll, and hundreds of others whose names we'll never know. They weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things under enormous pressure. They deserve to be remembered not just as historical footnotes, but as true heroes of World War II, as important in their own way as the soldiers who fought on the beaches and the pilots who flew in the skies. Their story reminds us that wars are won not just by courage and firepower, but by intelligence, ingenuity, and sheer determination. That captured Japanese manual, pulled from a sinking ship in the Coral Sea, was a game changer, not because it magically solved the puzzle, but because it gave talented, dedicated people the clues they needed to solve it themselves. And they did. Against enormous odds, they succeeded. And in doing so, they changed the world. All right, everybody. That's the incredible true story of how American Codebreakers cracked Japan as unbreakable, JN-25 code, and how a single captured enemy manual helped reveal the fatal flaws that Japan never knew existed. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most fascinating and important stories of World War II. This is the kind of history that doesn't get enough attention, the behind-the-scenes intelligence work that shapes the outcome of major events. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. Seriously, it makes a huge difference in terms of the YouTube algorithm and helps these stories reach more people. And definitely subscribe and hit the notification bell because I've got more fascinating deep dives coming up. Next time I'm thinking about covering either the story of how the Allies broke the German Enigma code, which is an equally incredible story with its own twists and turns, or maybe the incredible story of the Ghost Army, the American unit that used inflatable tanks, sound effects, and fake radio traffic to deceive the Germans during and after D-Day. Let me know in the comments which one you'd rather hear about. I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know what you're interested in. Also, drop a comment and let me know. Did you know about the JN-25 code-breaking operation before watching this video? Do you think enough credit has been given to these intelligence heroes? What aspects of this story surprised you the most? I love hearing your thoughts and perspectives. History is better when it's a conversation, not a monologue. If you want to support the channel even more, consider becoming a channel member or checking out my Patreon. The links are in the description below. Your support helps me spend more time researching and creating these in-depth historical videos. It takes dozens of hours to research, write, and produce each video, and patron support makes that sustainable. I also want to give a quick shout out to the books and sources I used for this video. I'll put a full bibliography in the description. If you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend And I Was There by Edwin Layton, Codebreakers by David Kahn, and Miracle at Midway by Gordon Prange. These books provide incredible detail and first-hand perspectives on the code-breaking effort. Thanks so much for watching, for sticking with me through this hour-plus deep dive into World War II intelligence history. I really appreciate you being here. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the most important victories aren't always the ones that make the headlines. I'll see you in the next one.